What are the ingredients to bringing academic frameworks into more productized versions that are ready for industry?
Stanford is a great example of a good model of university-industry cooperation. So this is where centers like mine come in. We're looking at the new trends in areas that industry is funding at universities. We look at commercialization by startup companies. I'm trying to bring more information about how Asia is developing. A lot of people are unaware of the advanced level of technology development that's going on in other places. Asia is developing an intra-Asian network that we need to be part of.
For a startup who doesn't have experience navigating the bureaucracies of a large corporation, is there an ideal way for them to overcome this challenge? Hello, Professor Dasher.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm very excited to come and interview you today, kind of get your insights as someone who has had experiences across multiple different sectors, from academia to the government to industry. So to start off, Professor Dasher, can you give us an introduction of yourself and your involvement in the startup ecosystem?
Okay, so for a long time, I've been the director of the US Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford. This is an industry-funded center that does both education and research. We're a membership-based business model, which means that we have member companies, and the member companies pay an annual fee, and that's where all of our expenses come from, including my salary. So I've done that for a very long time. Before that, I did business in Tokyo. I was a board director of a couple of small companies that were developing international business. And before that, I was in charge of the Japan and Korea training programs for American diplomats. I was part of the U.S. Department of State, and for 4 years I was attached to the embassy in Tokyo with responsibilities in Seoul. So, I come to this from kind of an unusual path. My PhD's in linguistics, and I decided I didn't want to be a college professor. And so that's why I went to work for the State Department. And yet, here I've been back at Stanford for more than 30 years now.
That is very cool. I'm sure that there are a lot of different experiences that you've had that have similar underlying principles, going from linguistics to government to now.
I think the thing that's been most rewarding for me is to see how Asia has developed over the last 35 or 40 years. It's truly remarkable. The miracle that happened in China, the current growth that's happening in Southeast Asia, the transition of economies like Japan and Korea to being as advanced as anything going on in Europe and the U.S. So incredible change. And of course, we're in the middle of an industrial revolution now too, so that now the world is digitally interconnected in a way that it never was before. This means that we really ought to redefine international business. It's not just selling things in other countries, it's being able to work real time with people in other countries and optimizing your market presence in really a worldwide basis.
Can you touch a little bit more about the Industrial Revolution that we are going through, specifically how that relates to Asia startup ecosystem as well?
Okay, well, basically this is part of something that really started after the war with the development of semiconductor technology. Digital technologies are spreading, and so now with cloud computing, you may not know where your data is, and you may not know where the processing is being done. That has become so transparent to people that we expect our smartphones to do things for us without thinking about the amazing technologies that are behind it. So that's one aspect of the revolution, is just the spread of digital technology. The second major aspect is the spread of the tools that get value from digital technology. So the big one for the last few years is artificial intelligence. And it's the equivalent of steel making in the big industrial revolution of the 19th century, or something that really changes not only the way business is done, but the way lifestyles are running. So think about it. Asia was early in the digital revolution in places like Korea and Japan. And then more recently, you've seen the old, in the US, it was wired first and then became wireless. But really, in Asia, the spread has been wireless as fast as wired. And this means that some farmer in the middle of Indonesia is going to have market information in real time. And that changes everything. It really allows people to create value in ways that they could not before.
What are some of the opportunities that you see emerging within regions like Southeast Asia that might not have had the same infrastructural support?
Well, in economics, as people's incomes rise, you see them spending their money. And so the kinds of things that they buy have a direct correlation to what the average income in the country is becoming. So Southeast Asia right now is really hitting the middle class. China was there maybe 15 years ago, 25 years ago. And so China was a little bit earlier. But now in Southeast Asia, you do have some countries that are higher income. Malaysia is higher income per person. Thailand is medium high income per person. Places like Vietnam and Indonesia are still quite on the low side of that. But all over Asia, you're seeing new patterns, new kinds of lifestyles, the things that make people's lives more reliable as well as more pleasant.
What does that mean for entrepreneurs who might potentially be interested in those regions and building businesses there?
Well, what you see is you see a lot of B2C companies in Southeast Asia now. That's really the driving force, are new ways to bring value to the largest segment of the population you can. Now, in more advanced economies, you're seeing the use of more advanced tools. And that will be a range across deep tech that is almost always B2B, right? Where you're selling to other big companies that are trying to deliver things to large segments of the population. And you do see major platforms for B2C type work with new tools. So look at ChatGPT, right? That's a major new platform. It's really as much a B2C play as it is a B2B play.
So as you see all these different types of opportunities emerge in different areas within Asia, what are some of the challenges that you've seen in foreign entrepreneurs trying to enter those markets?
Well, entrepreneurship's never easy. And one of the things is we focus so much on the entrepreneurs that are successful that it's really important to remember what a difficult path it is, okay, just in general. I do think that with some of the new tools like AI, governments that regulate businesses for the safety of the people or for national security or whatever are not able to keep up with the technology development. One of the first times in my life I'm seeing private sector technology development so far ahead of what national labs are doing. Of course, national labs are looking at different kinds of problems, right? But artificial intelligence has been driven by the private sector. And so the government has a kind of new pressure on how to establish regulations quickly. And that process is a difficult process. Often the big companies have enough clout that governments kind of pay attention to their points of view when they develop regulations. But who's going to represent the startup companies? First of all, the startup company entrepreneurs don't have time to sit around and develop technology standards. And then the government regulations also may not be representing the points of view of entrepreneurs so much. So that's one challenge. I also think that we're dealing with a tendency to bubble. Information flows so quickly and the analysis is slower, so that everybody gets all excited about things like generative AI. So we've had this huge bubble in funding for generative AI. The valuations of companies that are built around generative AI is something like 7 times higher than the valuations of companies with other types of SaaS business software. So, okay, it's a bubble. What happens after the bubble? If it doesn't completely collapse, there's going to be this transition to focus more on real value creation. One good thing about business is that real value creation is kind of honest. People buy something because they want it. And so I think that if you're really focusing on filling the needs of whether it's the consumer market or the business market, you're really creating value. And the focus for AI is really moving into that now. I think that's a good way to understand agentive AI or AI agents, is that you have this artificial intelligence that's not just talking to you, it's doing what you ask it to. And of course, the technology development behind that's pretty astounding. It's pulling things from different models and, AI running other AI. But the point is that it sells if it provides people with something that makes their lives better.
So many great points there, Professor Dasher. I'm really curious about the part of government not being able to catch up to the speed of all these advancements. Yeah. What does that mean about the dynamic between the government as well as the private sector, given that it seems like a lot of the regulations are somewhat being formed by the big companies in the private sector?
Yeah. So big companies can hire people to have government relations, right? And so, of course, they have the ability, the time, and the resources to be involved in at least trying to influence government for how the regulation should be written. Now, there are different dynamics in different countries. I think one of the most interesting places about new approaches to government regulation is Singapore. Singapore was developing a framework for measuring the responsibility of AI, whether it's responsible or not. And they did this with representatives of different countries. The US and China were both there, and that's getting to be harder and harder to do. And the big company people were there, the academics were there, the national lab people were there, from really all over. And I think that was a very well thought out way to try to develop a new standard, a measurement standard for whether AI is being developed responsibly or not.
And bringing that then to the US, are there things that founders and people in the startup circle should be aware of as they try to navigate the different types of policies and regulations that are coming out, especially thinking that private companies, especially the large ones, are probably in their own interest trying to protect themselves as well?
So as we speak, there's a lot of uncertainty with what's going on in the US government. And so it's really hard to tell. I think that the most important thing, though, is to remember that in many ways, the private sector is not waiting for the government to let it do something here. That tends to happen in some other cultures. Unless the government passes a regulation allowing some kind of business, you don't get any startups in that sector. That's very much the case in Japan and also in France. But in the US, the private sector goes on by itself. Of all of the spending on research and development in the US, the gross expenditure on R&D, 70% is spent by the private sector. So the government is the source of funds for about, 25% or so. And then really at the basic research stage is where the universities are really strong, right? But product development, applied research, really the industrial sector leads. And that's especially the case these days with the use of big databases. The kind of size of the data analytics does favor companies with access to a lot of data. So remember, private sector is not dependent completely on government here. I would even say that even if the current government is not pro-climate tech, if there's a market for some climate tech item, then there will be private companies here that develop that technology. Now, this may actually push them to sell in Europe and in Asia more than they try to sell here. So I think that in some ways, the uncertainty in the US does work against the US. But the business sector exists in order to create value, and they will find ways to do that.
And so for companies who are in areas like climate tech that is being cut by the US government potentially, there's a lot of opportunity in overseas markets.
Yeah, I would definitely look. And, you know, you can start in Canada, but overseas markets are not going to cut back on their climate tech spending. The sad part about this, and I'm sure that the people who are very concerned about climate change would say this immediately, without the US support, it's really going to be difficult to have the kind of meaningful change that will mitigate the problem. But there's still going to be a lot of good value created by industry with new technologies that are more friendly to the climate.
Do you think there's value in startups working with the government today or trying to partner with the government in some way?
Well, there are some areas in which it's kind of obvious. So there is a lot of concern about national security. And that's undergoing the same transformation that I mentioned before. Whereas it used to be selling things in foreign countries, now it has to do with real-time cooperation. So data is a national security matter. That means that you can't avoid the government. It also means that I think that there are a lot of companies that may find early markets from government. So go back well before World War II. One of the first kind of big waves of industry in Silicon Valley had to do with wireless communications between North America and Hawaii. That was mostly funded by government contract. So this sort of thing is going to continue. Selling to the government is one thing. Watching what the government regulations are is also critical, right? And unfortunately, we are in a tendency to kind of, instead of harmonizing regulations across the world, they're scattering, right? They're all becoming incompatible. One of the biggest challenges with business between the US and China now is China's government approach to managing data security, where basically the government has a copy of everything. And okay, that's secure, but it's incompatible with the regulations here. And it's sure incompatible with the kind of GDPR regulations that are in Europe. So that's a difficulty. But I think that it's always been the case that when you build a company, you build it not just on one product, even though a startup company really needs to start with kind of one clear idea. But that idea is going to have different product market fits as your company develops. So you may start and go through the 0 to 100 stage for the startup company around one product. But if you're successful and your company goes public, then you're going to have multiple products in the market and keep doing innovation all the time. So along that path, government sales is certainly probable in some areas. I think that keeping an eye out for how the regulations are going is absolutely critical. And it's not only your business line, it's the context that your business is being done in. Suppose something changes the way people divide up their time, like if we all move to homeschooling, that's going to change education markets drastically. So we've seen that really, maybe not quite at that scale, but almost. The current movement toward electric vehicles has changed the entire supply chain of the automotive industry and the motorcycle industry and the scooter industry and now, flying helicopters, right?
Shifting a little bit to the academic side of it, one of the
Yeah,
things that you mentioned is that we are in a time where maybe sometimes national federal labs cannot keep up with the types of technology
yeah,
that's happening, all the advancements.
yeah.
What does that mean for academia and how is academia faring?
So academia is not all one thing either,
Mm,
right? I mean, there's different parts of the government, there's different industries. In the kind of closer to basic research level, a lot will depend on what kind of government funding is available. And the biggest supporter of basic research is the government, and the biggest performer of basic research is the university. So that is a direct connection to what the government will support and what the government's interested in. At the applied research stage is where you're looking more at the applications of the technology, and really industry becomes the dominant path for commercialization. So you'll have the large companies working with the universities to see early what kind of new things are coming out. And really, Stanford is a great example of a good model of university industry cooperation.
mm,
The academics have to establish their academic reputation, but they know that a lot of their students are going to go to work in industry. So there's a lot of freedom to let the PhD students decide what their projects will be
mm.
for academic value, but also because this will probably give the students a really marketable set of skills about 4 or 5 years later. By the time you get into product development, it's almost all business. Not the university's not very involved.
Mm.
So what you're really seeing in the university kind of centers on what I would call applied research, where you see practical applications of the kind of things that are coming out of the basic research at the university. So this is where centers like mine come in. We're looking at the process by which these research results become practical. We look at commercialization by startup companies. We look at patterns of technology licensing. We look at patterns of intellectual property protection. I'm looking at the new trends in areas that industry is funding at universities. So what I'm trying to do with our particular center at Stanford is to bring more information about how Asia is developing in this regard.
Mm.
That's something where it's still not down the street like Hewlett Packard is down the street, right? So I find that a lot of people are unaware of the kind of advanced level of technology development that's going on in other places. The entrepreneurs that have really interesting companies from other places. And it used to be that, again, an old model of globalization, you had US Japan, US Korea, US China, US India, whatever. Now Asia is developing an intra-Asian network
Mm.
that we need to be part of. In many ways, Silicon Valley is more a part of it than further east. We're very much integrated in Asia Pacific. And so that means there's a lot of interest in what, the people we're introducing, so that we try to be a place for people to hear new stories.
Mm. It's like a space for information
Yeah,
exchange as
right.
well. What are the ingredients to bringing academic frameworks into more productized versions that are ready for industry? And how does USATMC play a role in that?
So one of the most important things is the balance of the technology side that wants to move ahead and is really focused on technology. And in the university, we can do a lot of basic research precisely because it doesn't have to be connected to a business model,
Hmm.
right? So you have the technology people who are really interested in technology. But if the company is going to be successful, the business people tend to have a little bit more control. So the balance between those two groups inside a startup company is probably the biggest factor for its success. Of course, there's, a million ways a startup company can fail, and the paths to success are unfortunately not so common. But what we look at, and this is another area that we are looking at, is how startup companies interact with large companies. This is a process that is usually called open innovation, because the big company is not doing everything inside its own research group, its R&D group. But it's hard. Big companies are managing hundreds of development projects, and there's a lot of learning that they have to do in order to work well with startups. And conversely, the startup companies need to be able to keep their vision, not lose their big plan, but be flexible and recognize what kind of constraints their customers are working under.
Well, what are the types of values that working with these larger corporations provide to startups? And what should a startup be aware of as they're navigating this space?
Well, first of all, the big corporation is typically interesting because it has some resource that the startup company needs. For instance, access to large amounts of data. Or possibly they would be a reference customer. It used to be in Asia that if you could sell something to Singapore Telecom, you were going to be a great startup. And so other investors in subsequent rounds of funding would see that this company had done something that worked out with Singtel, and they would get funding. So that kind of thing, having a reference customer is a value. There's a lot of insight into the quality standards. So a big company, one of the things that it has to do well in order to survive is to have good business processes and be able to operate on a worldwide scale. So that kind of traditional management is something that the startup companies can kind of take advantage of as they're continuing their own development. It's a learning process, right? So it really tends to be a resource-driven thing. Access to data, access to manufacturing capacity, access to a distribution network, sometimes even access to brand, right? You make something and then the big company puts its brand on it. So there are a number of reasons that startup companies want to work with large firms. The thing they have to watch out for is that the dynamics inside the large firm may make it difficult to innovate. You've got people in the business units that will actually deliver this resource at scale who are busy. They're busy satisfying their customers right now with their current products. So you come to them and say, hey, we're doing a proof of concept around this new thing. They say, go away. And sometimes they're telling their own R&D group that, and certainly the startup companies are not part of the family yet, right? So you can tell your own R&D group to go away and you know that they'll still be in the company. But if you tell the startup company that, they may never show up again.
For a startup who doesn't have experience in this space and navigating the bureaucracies of a large corporation, is there an ideal way for them to overcome this challenge?
Wow. A lot of it is case by case. I have to be very frank. However, it combines observation and kind of sitting back once in a while and thinking why things are happening the way that they are. Generally, insufficient understanding of the dynamics inside the big company is the biggest reason that startup companies have trouble. So why is this POC not going anywhere? How do we get them convinced to scale up? That sort of decision making, you really have to understand what's on the mind of the strategic people inside the big company.
The importance of context and really understanding why a company is the way it is and
Yeah.
what people are motivated by.
Now, I'll turn that around and say that the big companies need to understand the pressures that the startup is under. Because here in Silicon Valley, we're kind of expecting 100% a year growth. You know, a company has 15 people this year, they'll have 40 people next year, they'll have 75 or 80 the following year. And that scale up is very rapid. It means that a startup company is very time conscious. And the big company may not feel that kind of pressure for time. You know, the startup company probably has 18 months runway before their funding runs out. So they really have to be ready for the next round of funding or for gradually moving more and more into revenue-based business. So they're really under incredible pressure to move fast. That's why they're good as startups. And the big companies are saying, well, you know, we need to be careful about this. How to get those two wheels moving at different speeds to mesh is a big challenge.
Now, the USATMC is the intersection of startups, of industry, as well as of academia. In your experiencing working at the center, have you seen the ideal frameworks for partnerships between these three different sectors?
Well, of course we are. What can I say? No, I think that what I do see is I see some really good people who are committed to making the world a better place. And this is not at the expense of good business. This is how they see good business, right? And the people who are really trying to make innovation happen are by and large a really interesting group. We're trying to operate on this on an international scale and help startup companies here work with large companies that are from Asia. There are a couple of Asian later stage startups in our membership right now. So we're trying to help them develop their markets here in the US. What I do in the context as a university center is to be the place where groups can come together and learn from each other. But really, as an academic institution, the question is, why is this good for the university? And first of all, it's a great exposure for students to meet entrepreneurs from other countries, to meet large business representatives from other countries, to have a sense of what life is like once you graduate, before you graduate. So one of our chief things is for the students. We also try to help companies that are interested in working with individual professors. We can make introductions. And to a certain extent, I am trying to educate our member companies how to work with professors. So we're kind of an information nexus and also sort of a place to look at best practices and also keep an eye out for emerging opportunities.
What are the motivations for member companies to get involved with the USATMC?
Most of the time, it's because they want to know something about Silicon Valley, very frankly. Our focus on innovation means that a lot of our member companies are Asian companies and they're interested in Silicon Valley. So we may be the place you send a scout before you set up an office in the Valley. So sending someone to us, as we have a position we call visiting scholar, where the company pays a fee and I work with the person like I would work with a postdoc, although most of our visiting scholars have master's degrees. But work with them for a year on a project that their company is interested in that fits our area of focus. And then sometimes they go on out, the company sets up a permanent office on the basis of what we did that year. Other companies are interested in emerging areas of technology, and they would like to have someone help open the door at Stanford to more technical research at Stanford. So we kind of help open that door too. A lot of them are interested in the startups in Silicon Valley. So one of the big things that I'm talking about with our member companies is the process of evaluating a startup and deciding how you can work together, and also how to take that and make it successful back in your home office, right? How to avoid this gap between the innovation side of the company and the current business side of the company, because that's often, a block. How do you get over that block? So that's innovation management topics we're looking at.
In the many companies, startups, individuals that you've mentored and worked with, whether it's from an Asian startup, corporation, what has made them successful in the US? Because the US is a huge market,
Yeah.
but it's a very hard market as well.
Yeah, what a great question. I think that, to be frank, the flow has typically been new idea from the US into the Asian company. And so going into the Asian markets has been probably a bigger flow than the idea from Asia coming here. The system here in the Valley is so well set up that if you've got a good startup company and they have something that might work in the US market, there are lots of people who would love to help you get in. So we can just kind of make a few introductions and stay out of the way. With the US kind of the Silicon Valley ideas going into Asian markets, a lot of it is just helping people to build the context around the business relationship. One of the things that we have found, sounds obvious, is that startup companies that have really good relationships with Asian companies have a mutual appreciation, even more than just respect for the quality of the product or the quality of the business. It's the appreciation for the cross-cultural communication that both sides are interested in, to show that you're interested in the localization of whatever you have for that particular company's market, is an example of cultural sensitivity. And the flip side, where you have these companies from Asia that are very happy and getting energy from working with the startups here.
It goes back to how much of business is actually human psychology and how you make another person feel.
Yep, exactly right.
And going back into USATMC,
Yeah.
for people who want to get involved, or for startups who want to get more involved, how can they do that? And could you also touch a little bit on your course this upcoming spring?
Okay. So for the startup companies, if you're in Asia, I'd love to hear from you, because we are always looking for good speakers for our seminars. In general, I'm very happy to get short emails and see if there's some way to work into a schedule. For US startup companies, it's the same kind of thing. Come to our programs. We do our programs on Tuesday afternoons. These are public seminars. One of the unusual features is that not just for university students, it's really a place for university and industry to be in the same place at the same time. Our speakers are mostly company people. And so we are planning our current set of seminars for this spring on entrepreneurship in Asian high-tech industries. We'll have startups from most of the major Asia economies featured this spring. We also do a autumn series that's similar, but we have big companies as well as startup companies in the autumn series. And it's on some topic in international technology management. So this past year, we focused on how supply chains and manufacturing are realigning to be more resilient. I haven't completely fixed the topic for this fall, but we'll start that again late in September. We will do these Tuesday afternoons at 4:30. Our website, asia.stanford.edu, has videotapes and speaker slides from just about all of our programs, and at least for the last few years. So companies, people are welcome to see what we're doing. We would welcome anyone to come to our seminars. And in general, if you think you have some sort of an interest in joining this club, this industry affiliates program, I'd be happy to talk to you and set up a presentation and let companies know in more detail what we do.
Yeah, I think your organization is such a resource powerhouse for so many different individuals. And I highly recommend the spring course and the fall course to many people who are interested in learning more about entrepreneurship, learning more about what's going on within the Asia ecosystems. Your course was actually what inspired me to begin this entrepreneurship route.
Okay.
And I thought it was the perfect, really, starting point to help me understand how does entrepreneurship work, both within Asia, but also within US as well, because I think a lot of the underlying principles remain the same. So thank you very much.
You just made my day. Thank you very much, Manfei. And thanks for the interview. Thanks to everybody for watching.